Right there. Look at that right there. Look at that head shake, man. Oh, man. That's what we came up here for.
Okay, live in 3, 2, 1.
Well, thank you, Nick Rydell, for showing up.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, so this is great. Nick and I have had a lot of conversations over the years about different fisheries topics. And why don't you introduce yourself, Nick, and tell us who you are, what you do.
Yeah, so my name is Nick Rydell. I'm a fisheries biologist out of the Glenwood office. I started there in 2019. I'm kind of a jack of all trades, I guess you would say, in our office. So I'm kind of in charge of our education and outreach. I'm also the Musky guy out of our office. I've been the Creel survey guy, and then I also serve on the Panfish Tech Committee along with Mike. So I represent Region 1, the Northwest region for panfish management.
That's great. And one thing you forgot to leave out, you're also a hardcore angler.
Yeah,
so I think that's really important that people understand that you're not just a guy sitting at a desk or pushing paper or data. Like, you go out and participate in the resource and are avid, hardcore, multi-species angler.
Yeah, so, I got into this because I always enjoyed angling. And that's one thing I like to bring up to, kind of our stakeholders in the area is, I want these lakes to be good because I'm fishing them too. So, I'm looking out for your best interest because it's also in my best interest. I want a good bite on these lakes as well.
Yeah, and that's great. And I think, of course, we want all kinds of folks like you managing the resource. And I think that's one of the barriers that can often happen with fisheries managers and the public is there might be some disconnect between how active is this manager utilizing the resource and how avid are they. And often anglers and managers are speaking different languages, which creates friction. And so it's great. Really, more Nick Rydells out there is all the better for me. So yeah, man, you have been pretty busy this spring. Reached out quite a long time ago now to see if you would come to the studio and shoot this with us. And you're like, yeah, man, I got a lot on my plate. So give us a little idea on what activities DNR is up to in the spring.
Yeah, so out of our office, we also have pretty diverse workload in the spring. So as soon as the ice comes off of the lakes and our walleye ponds, we are out on the water. We end up raising a lot of the walleye fingerlings in the state, and since we had such a mild winter this year, we were able to harvest carryover walleye fingerlings this spring and stock those into ponds. We also end up basically going out and netting fathead minnows as well. That's used in musky production. So as soon as the ice comes off, that's what we're doing. And then we don't have a walleye egg take in our work area, but we have a hatchery. And actually, our hatchery produces about 50 million walleye fry every single spring. Wow. But we go and assist other areas with egg takes, so we'll go up to Cutfoot or we'll help in Spicer. We'll kind of travel throughout the state and help with their walleye egg takes and bring those eggs back. And then we also do a lot of panfish management. So, we have 17 lakes in our area that are part of the Quality Sunfish Initiative. There's also a statewide project going on right now for black crappie. Chris Smith is a research scientist out of our office. So this spring we're out on those lakes doing targeted panfish assessments in the spring. And then we also do a lot of musky work. So we're out on our musky lakes doing some nighttime electrofishing. To basically go and pit tag as many fish as we can to conduct some population estimates. So we generally work, somewhere around 30 days straight in the spring. And for people listening, don't worry. We're essentially salaried. It's not time and a half. We're not it's not like we're getting overtime here. So we're essentially salaried, but we usually work around 30 days in the spring straight. And then now we kind of get into our normal kind of standard lake survey schedule this time of year.
Yeah, that's a busy spring. One species you didn't touch on, or a couple species, were bass. Do you guys do much with bass in the spring as well?
Yep. So every one of our lakes that we do what we refer to as our standard lake survey, which usually consists of trap nets, mainly targeting panfish, gill nets, mainly targeting walleye, northern pike, and perch. And then we also will do electrofishing on all those standard lake surveys, which is usually around 15 lakes every summer. We usually do that all in the spring as well.
When the water's cool. And
Yep.
and so that's pretty cool that just like a lure might select for a certain type of fish, this gear that you're using to sample also selects for different fish, and bass don't sample that well.
Yeah, so generally one of the things with bass is they're pretty good at seeing and avoiding our nets. So every once in a while, you'll get a bass in a trap net, but it doesn't really sample them that well. So we rely on that electrofishing, usually when water temps are around 60 degrees, and fish are coming up to stage to spawn. We try and get them just before the spawn. Sometimes they'll actually be actively spawning at the time, just because we have so many lakes we're trying to electrofish in, a couple week window there.
Well, and we had, as you're well aware, the weather has been so unusual lately. In May, we had that crazy hot spell that just kind of came out of nowhere, like the middle of May. And so, what are you seeing with that? We had very little runoff, we had very little precip, and we had really hot weather. What does that mean? Who wins in the fish community when you have weather like that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've seen in our area, and I got to give Chris Uphoff credit for looking at this. He's a fisheries biologist in our area, and he's actually on the walleye tech committee representing Region 1 as well. And what we've really seen in our area is we rely on that spring runoff for walleye recruitment, whether it be, the high water levels kind of bringing the levels up enough that the gravel and cobble along shoreline is creating more spawning habitat for walleye, or runoff really causing a nutrient input. So we have algal production, and in turn, walleye fry have something to eat. So that kind of dry spring is not really usually good for walleye recruitment. Another thing is, what we've kind of seen with that warm up and cool down is, we kind of got into the ideal water temps for crappie spawning. They all came up, they were on beds, and then it cooled down, they pushed back off, they came back up, they pushed off, and most of the crappies we're seeing this year are still full of eggs. We've also seen some bass still full of eggs. So it's probably not going to be a great year for crappie recruitment either. And then, we're into mid-June here, and we got, water temps still in the low to mid 60s, which is not usually real conducive to bluegill spawning either. Usually our best bluegill spawning is a warm, like increasing trend in the spring.
Sure. Yeah. There's just been so much variability lately. I saw the same thing that I did a few lakes that I was fishing when it was kind of peak of the bass spawn. Like I did not see nesting bass, saw nesting crappies, saw nesting bluegills, but I didn't really run into any largemouths anyway that were nesting. So it was just a weird deal for them. But crappies, it is interesting that even though we didn't get a crappie spawn, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's bad for crappie fishing in the long run, right?
Right. So, yeah, crappies in general are very cyclical. So, it's not uncommon to go several years without a big crappie spawn. And then usually when it happens, right, there's kind of this open niche. There hasn't been any crappies that have spawned for a few years. So then when it does happen, that year class usually hits big. And that might carry you through for quite a few years, where you have this really big year class that kind of hangs on for a long time.
Yeah, and that's the boom and bust cycle of crappies.
Yep.
Yeah, it was super cool. And obviously that's different than bluegills. People think crappies, bluegills is the most common panfish, but they're very much different in their life histories and population dynamics, correct?
Yeah, so one thing is, they're both nest builders. So in both cases, the males are building and protecting nests. One difference is that bluegills might spawn multiple times within a year. So, usually if the ideal conditions aren't good for a crappie, they're just going to abandon it, and it's not going to happen. Bluegills, they want water temps, in the upper 60s, pushing 70 degrees to spawn. And we've actually seen in our area, bluegill spawning in 17 feet of water into the beginning of July, right? They're chasing that 70-degree water out deeper as it happens. And a lot of times people might be like walleye fishing and thinking they just happen to be catching bluegills, but they might be on beds in 17 feet of water. And before side imaging, people didn't really realize that was the case.
Yeah.
And now we see that quite a bit. But, bluegills in general have a very different life history where they have this ideal water temps for a long period of time, where they have multiple chances to spawn and might spawn multiple times in a year. Crappies are very cyclical. Generally, we have bluegill recruitment almost every single year, but it can be somewhat variable in the size of those year classes as well.
Sure. And I definitely we'll dive into this topic in even more detail with some of the management practices that are going on with the Quality Sunfish Initiative and issues we have with panfish management. But one of the other elements before we get out of your DNR work here, the stuff you're doing in the spring, another thing that you were very proactive in, which I thought was cool, was reaching out to the Musky community in that Alexandria area. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I know there was a lot of folks who were pretty excited that you guys are doing that.
Yeah, so we actually, I got to give Storm Kettle Hut credit. He was actually at Christopherson's, the local bait shop, and one of the local Musky guides was in there, and they were doing some chatting, and basically said, maybe we should have a meeting and kind of discuss, because it was pretty apparent, within the DNR realm, we're a lot about the science side of things, but we maybe don't always do the best job at communicating some of the work that we actually are doing. So they were kind of unaware of some of the work that we had going on in our work area, and we ended up having a meeting this winter where we kind of discussed, some of the musky work that we were doing, the population estimates we were doing, and we had this discussion, and in turn, Storm and I met with Carrie Hoppy from Musky Mayhem, and then Jeff Schulte, he's with Fish Bumper and Bomb Squad Baits, and talked about doing a musky tournament in our area where anglers could essentially collect data for us. So in the 3 lakes in our area, Oscar, Lobster, and Miltona, we actually have a musky tournament going on, and it is through the Fish Donkey app. It's $5.01, so pretty cheap. And with that, you'll need to buy a pit tag reader, which you can get online for around $30. And we're hoping that we'll get enough angler participation, they'll catch enough muskies that we can use that within our population estimates to kind of really boost it, and then also get additional, growth and recruitment and survival estimates with some of that data.
That is super cool, and it was before my time, but all the old timers that talk about the boom of Minnesota muskies back in the day, talk about it just being a collaboration with the agency and stakeholders, and so I give you props big time for that, because partnerships win. When there's conflict, it seems like nobody wins. So anytime there's that open line of communication back and forth, it just seems like it's a win for everybody, and that's super cool that you're doing that. And I know Brad and Carrie are super excited about that project. And so anybody that's musky fishing over there, and really anybody musky fishing the state, should consider having a pit tag reader, because we can just learn more and more about what's happening with our muskies.
Yeah, and the more data we can collect, the better our estimates will be. So, this is a way for musky anglers to participate in the data collection process, and in turn make it so we can better manage our musky waters.
Yeah, and so it's not just and so people know it's not just Oscar, Lobster, and Miltona that have pit tag muskies. There are pit tag muskies throughout the state, many bodies of water. From that 2016 stocking, like every fish since has had a pit tag. So definitely worth having. And then there's another, which is out of your work area, but leech has been a hot topic, and I know they're looking at some population estimates up on Leach, Kristen Patterson at BSU, and then Andy Hafes, and those guys are doing another big project up there. So muskies were kind of like in the basement, dark room. Nobody wanted to deal with them for the past few years, but it's cool that people are doing stuff, and anglers can participate on the Leech Lake thing. They can do a little fin clip, so they're trying to do some basically genetics. Sampling to try to get an estimate because they're not pit tagged on. There's a few that are pit tagged, but not. The population as a whole isn't. So yeah. So anyway, that is definitely cool stuff. So one of the hot topics this winter, this is a good segue because muskies are always a hot topic, but you, again, being proactive, decided you take a peek at some of the Creel interviews that have happened in the state of Minnesota and analyze that data regarding technology's use and its effectiveness for catching fish. So can you give everybody kind of the 10,000-foot view of that, and then we'll dive into some of the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, so if people aren't familiar, a Creel survey is essentially an angler survey. So it kind of consists of two main components, where a Creel clerk will go out and they will essentially count the total number of anglers across the lake, whether it be driving across the lake or sometimes on large lakes they'll use an airplane to fly over and do these counts. And then also angler interviews. So, some listeners probably were part of a Creel survey before. It was mainly done on our large walleye lakes within Minnesota. So like Mille Lacs, Red, Leech, Lake of the Woods, where a Creel clerk essentially goes and interviews anglers. They see what species they're catching, the size of fish that anglers are catching and keeping versus releasing, what time they started that day versus what time they ended. And there's kind of two different types of Creel surveys, which will be important here in a little bit. But there's roving Creel surveys, where essentially the Creel clerk is going around the lake and actively interviewing anglers as they're fishing. And that's usually done on more small to medium-sized lakes. And then on the flip side, there's access-based Creel surveys, where the Creel clerk is sitting at the access and interviewing people as they come off the lake, and they're getting what we refer to as completed trip interviews. And those are useful for getting a total, like how did you harvest your limit, that type of deal, more so than catch rates. And essentially these Creel surveys have been going on forever. Mainly on our large walleye lakes. And then recently we started kind of doing a few more on these small to medium-sized lakes. And when I started in 2019, funding was available to do some of these small and medium-sized lakes. And it was around that time I was, forward-facing sonar came out 2015, wasn't really high adoption rate at that time. So Panoptic was released in 2015, 2018. That first version of LiveScope was released, and it was kind of like on my mind. I was kind of curious, both professionally and personally, like, well, is this going to increase catch rates? My kind of hypothesis was that maybe it would increase catch rates, but maybe not harvest rates. So when I was doing my next Creel survey on Lake Minnewaska, I incorporated a technology question at that time, and I did some checking around the state and was wondering if anyone was looking into this yet. And there was no one really looking into it, but there was a couple other offices also doing Creel surveys, and they had incorporated technology questions. So I wanted to standardize things moving forward so that we could kind of group all these Creel surveys together and kind of look at, the effects of technology over time as the adoption rate increased. So we have data starting in 2021, and I've analyzed the data through 2024, mainly looking at a comparison between forward-facing sonar versus all the other types of sonar. And to date, I have analyzed data from 39 lakes, with over 39,000 angler interviews. And as far as I'm aware, this is by far the largest data set of its type, not only here, but in the United States. There's been some other forward-facing sonar research, but it's usually only on a couple lakes. And what we kind of have seen so far is forward-facing sonar use is dependent on lake size. So generally, smaller lakes tend to have lower forward-facing sonar use, while larger lakes tend to have higher forward-facing sonar use. So for example, in 2024, we had lakes that still had forward-facing sonar use as low as 1.5%. But on the flip side, we had lakes that had forward-facing sonar use up to 37% within a lake. But overall in 2024, we did see a pretty significant increase in forward-facing sonar use from 2023. So 2023, we had about 10% of anglers were using forward-facing sonar during Creel surveys, and it went to about 20%, so doubled between 2023 and 2024.
And I want to point out too that this is not just open water. You're doing both open water and ice.
Yep. So open water and ice fishing. So that would be kind of pooling those two together. We also had a angler survey, a mail-in survey that took place in 2023 from the DNR, and it saw about the same. About 10% of people said they had used forward-facing sonar that year. And I'm guessing that kind of big increase between 2023 and 2024 was from a few reasons. There was a release of kind of updated versions of forward-facing sonar for quite a few companies. So there's kind of a discounting of the previous, sonar from before. So it kind of made that entry point into forward-facing sonar a little bit cheaper than it was. So that was probably a big part of the reason why we saw that increase.
Sure. And so a couple other things. So we know that how does it, the big question is, how does it affect catch rates? And do you see anything change within certain species of fish being caught more frequently with the tech?
Yeah, so I looked at both open water and hard water seasons. I was mainly originally looking at more harvest-oriented species. So kind of my main objective originally was sunfish, crappies, walleyes, since they tend to be the most harvested species in the state. I also have incorporated largemouth bass and muskies into the data set as well. And so far, on the open water side of things, we have seen statistically no significant difference between forward-facing sonar users and all other sonar users, which was surprising to me. My original hypothesis was that it would increase catch rates. On the hard water side of things, we did see some statistical differences. So for the hard water side of things, for sunfish, crappies, and walleye, we did have statistically higher catch rates during the hard water season in roving creels. So during the roving creels, those on small to medium-sized lakes, for crappies and walleyes. And then on the harvest side of things, it was actually statistically lower for forward-facing sonar users for sunfish, but higher for crappies, no difference in walleyes. But if we looked at those access-based creels, which tend to be our large walleye lakes, there was no statistical difference there. And I think that's for a couple reasons. One, those large walleye lakes with the access-based creels, right, they tend to be destination fisheries. And so a lot of people going to them are fishing out of permanent ice houses, right? They're staying there for several days. Well, the technology probably isn't that effective when you're sitting in a permanent ice house and you're not being mobile and using it effectively. And then on top of that, they incorporate overnight trips. So someone might come on a Friday, leave on a Sunday when they're interviewed, and you're not really, you might have lines down overnight. You might have, rattle reels down, but the technology isn't really being used effectively during that overnight period. Well, it is included in the catch rate. Sure. So those have to be analyzed separately because our roving creels don't incorporate overnight trips, right? We're only out there during the day interviewing people. So a big part of that difference that we statistically saw a difference in the roving creels is probably because they incorporate a larger proportion also of open ice anglers as well as portable anglers, which are more likely to be using the technology effectively. I would like to note though, so the only statistical increase in harvest rates was for crappie during the hard water period in roving creels. And while it was statistically significant, it was only one more crappie for every 6.7 hours of fishing. So while statistically significant, it's probably not biologically meaningful. And and one thing that we've seen is that in general, forward-facing sonar users tend to be younger, and they're probably, right, if you're investing thousands of dollars into the technology, probably more likely to be avid anglers. And those two groups tend to be less harvest-oriented, with one exception, which would probably be guides, right? They're taking out less avid anglers, people that tend not to fish as much, and so when they go out, they want to harvest fish. So there's probably an incentive that's a little different on the guide side of things than there is on the average forward-facing sonar user.
Sure. Yeah. I can see how those results, would be, you could absolutely, I trust what you're saying regarding that. Clearly it is, the guide thing, if you pay somebody who's really proficient with this technology, it has, with all the other technologies combined, it has a very high likelihood of providing additional success, especially with winter basin crappies, right? We're well aware of that. And I think you looked into that on, was it Big Pine Lake? That you did some research on that too?
Yeah, so there's a Creel survey on Big Pine. And this kind of leads to kind of the next thing I want to look at is maybe it's not the technology, maybe it's the user, kind of like an angler effect more so, right? Like we would think the technology has the potential to really increase catch rates, but we're not seeing that in the data so far. And, in the case of Big Pine, guides accounted for only 5% of the effort, but 59% of the crappie harvest during the hard water period. So, there is some indications that there probably is these guides before were probably already above average anglers. And maybe the technology gives them the potential to even increase their catch rates further. It doesn't, seem like the average angler has really picked up on that yet. But, we're going to continue to look at this into the future for the coming years as well.
Yeah, and I think a big piece that's missing, and you and I have talked about this a lot, is that the old adage that, 10% of the anglers catch 90% of the fish. And it's, very likely that we're not seeing what's happening or have a clear picture of what's happening with these super users, guides, really avid anglers, because they might be going for private accesses. They're often out super early or come back really late. So it would be great if in the state we could have a means of collecting data from guides or people who are on the water all the time, where we can have this data sharing, where we can really get a good insight into what's happening. Because if Mikey wants to go out and catch crappies, with a flasher and an auger, you've got in a lake map, you've got a decent chance of catching crappies. Obviously, we've done it for years. But with a forward-facing sonar tool, it's just easier. And I also want to point out that the boom and bust cycle of crappies, for example, that's part of their life history. But in the 1970s or 80s, a skid house, a jiggle stick, and a bucket of minnows could fish out these little crappie lakes with guys sharing information over a cup of coffee at the cafe. What's changed now is that information exchange is instant, and the efficiency in which you can find them is faster. So it's what we could be dealing with more so than anything is a frequency event, right? So that the likelihood of particularly small lakes with crappies in the basin, fish that anglers desire, I'm not saying they're going to go extinct. I'm just saying the quality of the fishery that anglers want could be changing quicker, which, is something we'll have to look at likely in the future.
Yeah, I would say, kind of talking about in the past, people going out there, a lot of people were open ice fishing at that time. A lot of people in recent years have been worried about the amount of angling pressure, right? Especially with the advent of permanent ice houses, the amount of fishing pressure that occurs in the winter we've seen has really increased in a lot of lakes throughout the state. The one caveat I want to give people is, right, so like in the 80s, 90s, when people were open ice fishing or they had portables with no insulation, those people were probably a lot more effective because it was not enjoyable experience to go ice fishing a lot. It was cold. Yeah. And now people, we call it ice camping in our office. People are out there in permanent ice houses. If I don't personally own a permanent ice house, I don't know that I ever will, because as a fisheries biologist, when you look at the catch rates of people in permanent ice houses, it is terrible. It is so low just because people aren't mobile, right? So like 58% of people using forward-facing sonar are using it in a permanent ice house. And we saw this too when we go out and interview people. If you got a permanent ice house, what's another couple grand to spend on forward-facing sonar? And what we saw is we go out on a Friday interviewing someone, say on Minnewaska, Osakis. They have forward-facing sonar unit down. And like, there's fish 150 feet that way. I hope they swim over here. You come and you interview them on a Sunday, the fish are still 150 feet there and they haven't moved. So in general, I think that's part of it. Like, right, people like comfort more. So the average angler likes comfort a lot more than catching fish, it appears like. But the users that are open ice and portable, it's a lot of work, right? Like most people aren't willing to do, but they can work together with a forward-facing sonar unit and stay on top of the schools of crappies as they're moving around. And those are the users that are probably using it effectively. It's just right now, that is a small percent of already small percent. It's roughly 10% of forward-facing sonar users are using it open ice where it actually is effective. And that's probably where the potential lies, right? Not sitting in a permanent ice house using it to watch fish 150 feet away.
Yeah. And it's engaging if you're going to sit in a permanent fish house. I'm not big into it, but if you can put it on down and view it on a 60-inch screen, like, it makes the experience a lot more fun. And the tech it's not giving you any more advantage than a flashers, essentially. I mean, but yeah, to your point, I would say either the efficiency and or effectiveness, which are tied together with the effort, is, where, people who are on the front edge of this can see the potential for changing opportunity outcomes for anglers down the line, right? Yep. So, and the Musky case, of course, we keep always coming back to this, where, one of the areas of concern, just like the crappies in the basin, a giant muskie that's floating around in outer space is really susceptible to being located with this technology. And, historically, the efficiency of contacting one of these, like, a very, very low probability of encountering these fish. And now the opportunities for encounter have skyrocketed, right? I mean, certainly wouldn't use the word exponential, but the probability of encounters are much greater. And so that is, of course, of concern. And so we look at these harvest issues, but then there's also, the things I consider, like, how does that change the opportunity outcome, right? So if fish are caught, they often are conditioned to pressure. And so, what does that mean? So are we really pushing, if you want to be successful at catching fish, and that's our job, is to sell people the latest rods, reels, lures, lines, electronics. But it does seem like in many cases where fish are really pressured, you almost have to have this level of technology to to have the same results that you might have had 15 years ago with less tech. You just have to keep adapting to the changing conditions, and technology is the tool that helps you do that.
Yeah, and I would say too, right? So I have data for muskies. It's kind of limited right now. I think I have interviews from like 700 and some anglers that were targeting muskies. Overall, there was no statistical difference. Catch rates were higher for forward-facing sonar users. The only thing is, there's a lot of variability there. Most musky anglers, when they go out, are not going to catch a fish. And then you might have an angler that catches a couple fish. So, that's one thing that I'm really hoping here in the next year is to get a lot more musky data, because my overall data set is pretty good, over 39,000 anglers. The musky data is kind of limited right now. So that's kind of one of the focuses here in the next year, is hopefully to get some more musky data and better be able to analyze some of that. And all this is preliminary right now, right? Like the data collection's still ongoing. Want to get the word out about it so people are kind of know what's going on, but the data collection's still ongoing, and ultimately the analysis will change in the end. But we are looking into muskies too. We just don't really have enough data right now, and it's only from a few lakes. Yeah,
and one of the things I hear and I consider also is like, how do you gauge angler honesty? Because I flat out tell you that I know very few musky anglers who, if they went to the lake and saw you and said, how'd you do musky fishing? If they had a banger day, they're going to tell you they blanked.
Yeah.
They're not going to share, because those opportunities are so few and far between and so priceless that they don't want to share it with the guy who's standing at the access, because they know that they're going to be like, hey, this guy just pulled in. He got 5, So they keep that information really guarded. So a means to collect that data that would almost be more private and open anglers up to be willing to share that, knowing that that information that's hyper important currently, they don't want to share it with the guy who's going to tell the guy who's going in, right? But if it's private and it's analyzed later, I think, that would be really a good means of data collection.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the reasons why, we've been working on this fish donkey tournament, so this is a different way to try and get at some of that musky data, so that when people submit a fish, we're not getting your location. We're getting basically from Fish Donkey at the end, we're going to get the length of the fish, what lake it was caught on, and the pit tag number.
Sure.
So this is a way that's kind of anonymous. We're not getting your name. We're getting angler 1,
Sure.
So that's one way to get at it. We're trying to get so that anglers are kind of anonymous, so that we can collect some of the data. On the flip side of things, we know from Creel surveys in general that when we have harvested fish, we know that data is legit because the Creel clerk measured it. They have the species.
Sure. Yep.
When it's a reported released fish, we're relying on the angler for that, and we know that anglers in general, from Creel survey data, they overestimate the size of fish.
You're telling me anglers lie?
Yeah.
Come on.
So generally, if an angler tells you the size of a painfish, you are going to probably subtract at least an inch on it. And if they tell you on a game fish, it's usually a couple inches. So they generally overestimate the size of fish. But really, right, like in these Creel surveys, we are reliant on those released fish, the reported size. So we kind of take it with a grain of salt for the reported fish. But then also too, like right for the case of muskies and looking at forward-facing sonar versus all other sonar users, the assumption is, right, that the dishonesty is probably the same between both groups, right? So like if one group is not telling us about how good of a day they had, the assumption is it's probably the same whether they were using forward-facing sonar or not using it. So it's kind of our way, like, well, the data, maybe is not 100%, but the assumption is that both groups are underreporting the same, so it's at least comparable between them.
Hey, a special thanks to Seafoam for supporting the Angling Edge Buzz. And we're going to talk about a product that I feel anybody who's on the water should have in their boat, and that is Bugs Be Gone. This is an amazing cleaner to have in your boat. This stuff will get rid of any organic stains or crud that you might have that happens while you're fishing. So coffee spills, blood, fish poop, if you've got bugs stuck to the back of your talon or your cowling, you just spray this stuff on. You want to apply it to a cool, dry surface, and it's water activated. So let it soak for just a minute, and it's water activated. You just wipe the stuff down, and it is remarkable how it can get rid of some of the nastiest stains that you'll encounter when you're on the water. So I keep a bottle of this in the back of my boat, and I would recommend that you do it too. When we're looking at this question of like, does forward-facing sonar affect catch rates? And of course it can, you know, it can lead to higher catch rates. It can lead to lower catch rates. It could lead to larger fish being caught. It could lead to a number of things. So, I mean, catch rates are always variable. It's never constant. And so what I struggle with, and I know you are way better at math and understand how to tease this stuff apart than I am. What I struggle with is like, so was it because you were working the jig really fast and you weren't fishing it really slow? Was it because you got tipped off? Was it because Lake Finder or OnX Fish told you that there's big fish in this lake? Was it because you've got a bigger boat? Was it because you were wearing rain gear that kept you? There are a zillion variables that go into a fish catch, and the one thing you can say about forward-facing sonar, particularly with fish in open water, is you can be extraordinarily precise with your presentations and target large fish, or in any fish for that matter. But like, what does it mean that if you and I decide we're going to go walleye fishing today, and traditionally we would go, let's just say we're going to go chuck at the bank or weed line or whatever, and we would catch a nice batch of, we'd catch 20 walleyes, and it was a great day. We had lots of fun. The biggest was 21 and caught some eaters. It was great. But now we want to go catch a 30-incher, and the two of us fish all day and we catch 3. You see what I mean? Like, yep. What is that? So you could say, well, these guys have forward-facing sonar and they caught 20 and they have 3. So, like, how do you begin to even process those different experiences? Because what you're doing may be radically different. So
yeah. So, right, like the main objective of my study is to look at averages for population level effects, right? So I'm not really teasing apart, the potential of the technology. I'm looking at how the average user is using it. There potentially will be a study out of the U of M, if it gets funded, that will more look into that side of things, like if certain user groups are able to take more advantage of the technology than others, say a fishing experience, those super users, if they're able to. I'm more so looking at kind of averages to look if there's population level effects more so. There is the potential, and I do have the data, I haven't analyzed it yet, that I could look at, if forward-facing sonar users have the ability to catch more trophy-sized fish, for example. I haven't looked at it yet, and we're also relying on reported lengths from anglers,
sure.
So it's kind of with a grain of salt in that regard. I will say that, there's been some studies in other states that have looked at forward-facing sonar as well. In the case of Arkansas, they looked at it specifically for crappies, and they found that catch rates were statistically higher for forward-facing sonar users, but no difference in size of those crappies. And then there was a couple studies out of Kansas that they looked at crappies first, so had anglers go out with forward-facing sonar and without it, fishing on the same lake, 2 different groups, and then they swapped. And there was no significant difference in catch rates between them or the size of fish caught. And then they, thinking kind of the musky example, like maybe a larger species that you could see more easily on forward-facing sonar would be more vulnerable. they did the same thing. They, they don't have a whole lot of muskie, so they did blue catfish down there. And what they reported was there was no difference in catch rates, no difference in size, but there was a perception by both groups that forward-facing sonar users had a higher catch rate when they didn't. But what they found was that forward-facing sonar users spent more time searching for fish than actively fishing, while non-forward-facing sonar users spent more time, obviously, just fishing, and they had statistically no difference in catch rates. And I kind of, one of those deals where, right, the technology has the potential, like, to have this advantage. So, the only significant difference was on the hardwater side, roving creels, higher catch rates for crappies and walleyes. Well, we would think on the hardwater side it has more of an advantage, right? Because you can drill one hole and you can look 100 plus feet in every direction, right? You can cover a lot more water a lot quicker. Covering water leads to more fish. And so it makes sense that that's the side of things where we saw the differences. On the open water side of things, and you and I were kind of talking about this earlier, like I rely a lot more on side imaging, unless you have a special bracket where you can go at high speeds with your forward-facing sonar. Most people, if it's on your trolling motor, if you just have it on a pole over the side of the boat, you're really usually operating at speeds of 2 miles an hour or less. Well, I can go with side imaging, look hundreds of feet off each side of the boat at 5, 6, 7 miles an hour. I can cover a lot of water a lot quicker. Now, when I find the fish, forward-facing sonar probably is an advantage between pitching right on top of a fish versus the side of a fish, and probably leading to more bites. But we're already mobile in boats, so we haven't seen that here in Minnesota. And I always question, why is that? Because other states are seeing significant differences. There was 2 studies down south. So one out of Texas, they were looking at crappies in 3 reservoirs down there, and then another one in Mississippi, 3 reservoirs. And I wondered if maybe my sample size wasn't high enough that I'm not seeing these differences. But in general, both these studies were 3 reservoirs, 1 year on each reservoir, 300 to 400 interviews. So much higher sample sizes here in Minnesota than some of these other studies. And they did see statistical differences, higher catch and harvest rates in those cases for crappies. And in the case of catch rates, nearly double for forward-facing sonar users. And I actually got a hold of Keith Meals. He's a fisheries biologist in Mississippi, one of the authors on the Mississippi study. And, talking to him, I was like, why aren't we seeing, my sample sizes are there. Why am I not seeing the same thing that you're seeing down in Mississippi? And with talking with him, they had 20 to 70% forward-facing sonar use, so quite a bit higher than we have here. And, you can't tell me that 70% of people in Mississippi can afford forward-facing sonar, So that's a pretty high percentage of people. And he told me that crappie fishing there on those 3 lakes is like SEC football. It is highly competitive. Every week there's a league, there's a tournament. These are primarily white crappies, so they're offshore pelagic in these reservoirs, and they're probably more vulnerable to forward-facing sonar, right? Like they're not in vegetation, they're not in structure like black crappies, and these are probably predominantly super users on these lakes. He said over 20% of the pressure in the case of Granetta was from guides. Mm-hmm. And they hosted the Crappie Masters there, and the winning bag was nearly a 3-pound average. I think it was like 2.9 pounds on 10 fish. They had fish pushing 4 pounds. We're probably not really comparing apples to apples in that case, where these are probably really good anglers, fishing, high scale tournaments, where I guarantee you we have that in Minnesota too, right? Like we probably do have these super users that are significantly increasing their catch rates, but it's not showing up in the averages. And maybe too, right? Like in the case of a black crappie, we saw statistically higher catch rates during the winter season, where they tend to be staging over basin areas where they're more susceptible, but we don't see it in the open water side of things.
Yeah, no, those are great insights, Nick, and that we really kind of just brushed by it, but that figure that you gave with 5% of the guided anglers with FFS accounting for 59% of the harvest, I mean, that's a big deal, and it begs the question of fairness in resource allocation, because in the state right now, you can be a guide tomorrow. We can both go guiding. Basically the requirement is having a fishing license. Obviously, there's more to it than that with insurance and whatnot, but the state doesn't have any requirements for information exchange. And I think in all the meetings I've had with the DNR, like whatever the financial aspect of that is, that's whatever, great, cover the administrative fees, but the data would be most useful to really understand how these folks, and I'm not picking on guides because they contribute economically, they introduce a lot of people to fishing, they sell a ton of fishing licenses. Yep. But what is the impact on the resource? We just need to know that, because that is a great example of, okay, so for the same fishing license dollars, this group harvested 60% of the fish. That's not allocating the resource, equally. And I'm not saying there's nothing fair or equal in fishing or anything in life, but there is a discrepancy there. Yeah,
like right now we have no guide license. We really don't have any idea how many guides there are in the state. And guides do, right? Like they're taking out people who probably otherwise wouldn't be fishing if there wasn't guides. They maybe don't have the equipment, don't have the means to go out the few times a year that they go out. It doesn't make sense to buy a boat. But it would be interesting to have some of that data, and knowing these future Creel surveys, we're probably going to be kind of looking more into kind of the super user side of things and seeing, right now it doesn't appear that there's a significant difference in general between forward-facing sonar and all other sonar users. There probably is, an angler effect on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we both fish, and we both understand that, like, I think it's important that everybody understands that Nick is talking about averages. And clearly, if you are familiar with this technology in combination with all the other technologies, it can give you some advantages that were just historically not possible before. So it fundamentally changes fishing. Like, you couldn't know that there was a 30-inch walleye swimming in outer space and land a lure on its head consistently.
Yep.
That's different. That's way different than anything that's ever been. So this data, I'm not at all arguing with your data, but what data I think is missing is the social, cultural component of it, because I have been in enough meetings over the course of the winter that there are people that just don't like it. I don't like forward-facing sonar. I don't want it on my lake. I don't think people should be using it. And I to me, this is not an all or nothing proposition, right? Like, I think it is worth listening to what the social input is, because I do think I'm not taking anything away from your data, but I think it's also a social question. It really is. Like, if there's a bunch of people saying, you know what, I don't like seeing all these guys going out there and Swiss cheesing my lake and catching all the crappies with forward-facing sonar. Make it go away. Like, keep that stuff off my lake, or there's an uproar. Or muskies in open water that I've been advocating against sharpshooting, like, hey, maybe we should modify some usage in some situations. It doesn't have to be a blanket, hey, no more forward-facing sonar in Minnesota. Nobody can use it. But, like, say, hey, things are changing quickly. And it's what's very clear is that technology and information exchange are massively outpacing the means in which we modify regulations, right? So that's the real issue that we're up against, in my opinion.
Yeah, so, I'm looking at population level effects. Can you say like averages? And my study isn't really looking at individual super users. And hopefully that U of M study gets funded and we'll kind of look more into that. But the regulation process does take time. On average, I think it takes about 2 years for a regulation to go
That's
through.
blistering speed. Yeah.
Unless the legislature gets really, really going on things and because even as the DNR, we rely on legislature a lot of times for regulations as well. It doesn't necessarily always matter what we say. It's ultimately up to the legislature whether they pass regulations or not.
Yep.
So it usually takes about 2 years, but in the case of some recent events, like if they want to, they can do it pretty quick. But generally, it's taken a couple years, and that's kind of why like when I started looking into this, I was like, I'm glad I started looking into it when I did, because like it's not really my job. This is was a side winter project that I started, and it's kind of blown up.
It did blow up, yeah.
Since then,
Yeah.
Now I got to give credit to the guys at the Glenwood office, because this is in addition to me aging thousands of fish structures and writing reports and 80-page Creel reports. Like they've had to pick up some stuff so I could work on this, but it's one of those deals where the between the time that we get the data and if like I said, right now there's no indication that in the case of those species that there's anything to be concerned about as far as harvest, but kind of the barotrauma side of things, if we do see an increase in catch rate, that wouldn't be accounted for in my study. That's kind of a separate thing. But there is a lag between, usually probably about 2 years.
Yeah, I would agree, and I got to give you props for, again, Nick, just diving into this and taking an objective look at it. And the best way it's complicated. The issue is complicated. While we're talking about complicated, I want to talk about two more things, and then we got to wrap this up. And it has to do with our kind of bass panfish style lakes that we have here in Minnesota. Which we've got the Quality Bluegill Initiative, which has identified some lakes that have, great potential for growing larger fish. And that seems to be what anglers want, is large sunfish. People don't seem to be raving for, we want more lakes with 4 to 6 inch sunnies in them. And then stunted pike. So how is the DNR, how are you looking at these lakes? There's some that seems like there's maybe hope, and others it seems like, man, it just seems like these lakes are full of 14 to 24 inch pike, and they're full of 2 to 6 inch sunnies. Like, what do we do?
Yeah. So, one thing is, obviously, I think it was in 2018, we had the zone regs put in place for northern pike. And that's in this area of the state, a 10 fish bag, 22 to 26 inch protected slot, 1 over. And I will admit I was somewhat skeptical of that, like how many people are going to be keeping pike under 22 inches. And we encourage people to do it, harvest pike under 22 inches. One thing that we've seen, especially with clear water, with zebra mussels, is, we've seen expanse of vegetation in these lakes, which is more conducive, right, to pike over walleye. And they directly compete with each other, over 90% diet overlap between pike and walleye. And so the main intent, right, encourage harvest of pike under 22 inches and release those bigger fish in the system, those 26 and overs. And already in some of the faster pike growth lakes in our area, we have seen that we're seeing more pike over 30 inches now than we have in the last few decades. So in those lakes with faster growth, we are seeing bigger pike already, and we encourage people to release those big pike.
Not spear them.
Yeah, because essentially, what those big pike do, right? There can only be so much biomass of a species in a lake. And whether that is 100 1-pound pike or 25-pound pike, that's the biomass in the lake. So if we can convert that biomass to larger pike, releasing them, they actually will cannibalize smaller pike and basically make it so recruitment decreases, so we don't have so many small pike in the system. we can slowly over time, kind of shift that size structure. But it's going to take time. Like we've only seen it, it's been 7 years, and we're starting to see it in some of our faster growing lakes, but those slower growing lakes are going to take a long time.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. I'll give you the example that we've got a cabin since the mid-90s on a little lake, and I studied pike in college, and so I have been actively harvesting small pike in that lake for damn near 30 years and have seen no result. There were still a few big pike in the lake in the 90s, but they've kind of disappeared, and there's very little angling pressure. It's a tiny lake, and it's just like once those, and it's not fertile, gin clear, sand pit, no inputs. It's just what it is, and it's really hard to overcome that. So it seems like almost anglers can't put enough pressure on small pike to really get them through that bottleneck to get into that. Because once they do get big, it seems like they keep going, but it's like that 20, right where the slot is, like for them to get past that, it seems really tricky.
Yeah, and the tough part too is those faster growing females, they are most vulnerable to being caught as well. And there's been some studies that have actually tried to do pike removal of small pike, and even using nets. Like you can't harvest enough. We basically need anglers to release the larger fish to basically control the smaller ones.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and I think that's the big takeaway with all of this is that big pike, having big predators on the landscape really leads to a really healthy ecosystem in terms of the quality fisheries that we desire as anglers, right?
Yeah, and that it's kind of similar, like for bluegill management, where bluegill are probably the most complicated species to manage because from a life history perspective, they're very complicated. The males have three paths that they can take. So they can delay maturity and put on what we call somatic growth, body growth, before they reach maturity. And then once they reach maturity, growth really slows because it all goes into gonad production. And usually, what people think of as those territorial, those bull males, they're the nest makers, and they basically dictate the size of the population. And then on the flip side, within the same lake, you will have small sneaker males, and they might mature at 4 to 5 inches. And then they're putting all this into gonad development. And then if they live long enough, they might become what we refer to as satellite males. So it looks like a female, but it's a male. And they have no input into nest guarding or production. They basically just kind of sneak in and try and fertilize eggs. Well, if we harvest the big bluegill in lakes, evolutionarily, there's an incentive. Well, if I'm just going to be harvested, I wait 8 years, to reach a length when I can reproduce, and I just get harvested before I can reproduce. Well, there's no incentive to that, right? So then it kind of flips and shifts towards a lower size structure. So if people want to catch big bluegills, the best thing they can do is release those bigger. The smaller, the better if you're going to harvest fish, right? Like you're well within your right to harvest fish, but if you can keep it, ideally below like 8.5 inches or so, and release those larger fish, it will only increase the size structure because only then the largest males will be able to fertilize eggs. Yeah,
that's super cool how that works. And when you guys were going through your bluegill regs, I'm not a fan of the 5 and 10 fish regs, but I was not a fan of I've just thought that there's nothing wrong with keeping 26-inch sunfish. That's not the issue. The issue is not keeping big sunfish, and I didn't feel that the regulation addressed that or communicated it as well. It's just saying, hey, don't keep as many big ones. The idea should be don't keep the big ones because they're precious. We don't have many of them. There aren't a lot of lakes. You're fortunate where you're at, where there's a little more productivity, but you get into this Brainerd Lakes area, Grand Rapids area, slower growth.
Yeah.
Like once they're gone, it's really, really, really hard to get those fish back. So
Yeah, and it's really hard to get people to keep 6 and 7 inch
well, yeah,
bluegills.
exactly. Yeah, I'm not saying
Yeah.
you should, but if you wanted to, there's
Yeah.
there even on the 5-fish lakes. I don't think it's,
Yep.
you know there's not a recruitment issue with
Nope.
sunfish. There's an issue with recruiting large fish into the fishery.
Yep.
If we
Yeah,
were
for
doing a that slot thing down the road, so that'll be, to your point, Jeremy. You can only keep 5. You can keep 20, but you can only keep 5 over
5 over
8 inch.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting to see what's happening. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm still, hats off for doing something. You guys worked really hard. You busted your ass trying to do something, and something happened. So. Quick shout out here to Atwater Chevy GMC in Aiken, Minnesota. They are a sponsor of the Angling Edge Buzz, and they also provide our vehicles for all the travel that we do. I just went through the process of getting a new vehicle, and to me it's incredibly stressful, and these guys take small town customer service very seriously. It did not feel like you're going into this deal where you're getting the used car salesman pitch. These guys are fishermen, which is great, and they're also really involved in the community. This is just as far as car purchasing goes, these guys are awesome to work with. And we just got a new ride here at the Edge, and we'll take you out back and show you this new GMC Sierra that is loaded with all of the bells and whistles. But one of the coolest things when you drive these new vehicles is the backup feature and what you see for trailering. When you're backing up, you can have a view where it looks like a drone is flying over the top of you. This is a super handy deal when you're trying to hook up your boat, or you're just backing trailers into situations that you can't see that well. So pretty amazing vehicle, really amazing people. So if you're looking to do some car shopping and you're in central Minnesota, I would strongly recommend you check out Atwater Chevy GMC.
Well, before Nick goes, I want him to talk about big sunfish, because you caught a big sunfish. You caught the new state record
sunfish guy.
bluegill.
I will say, in case people aren't aware, the new certified state record started over for 11 species across the state. Bluegill was one of them. So the state record was from 1948, Alice Lake, Hubbard County, 2 pounds, 13 ounces. But prior to 1980, fish didn't have to be weighed on a certified scale. But I do believe the previous state record bluegill was legit. So while it's cool, ultimately I don't feel I have the state record.
That's pretty cool, man.
But yeah, so it was 11 1/4 inches. I believe it was 13 1/4 around. It was a very thick fish.
Jeez.
It was 1 pound, 13 ounces. And the interesting part of this, right, is to see the size of fish. It's cool to see that people are still catching some really big fish now.
Yeah, they're super, super cool, super rare fish, and congratulations on that, man.
Thank you.
That is quite the accomplishment. And so, before we leave, can you tell everybody where exactly you caught that fish, so they've got an idea where to get that?
Lake Osagas.
Well, congratulations on that, Nick. That is outstanding. And again, thank you for coming. Thank you for all the work that you're doing over there. More and more people like you in the DNR who love fishing or are passionate about it, man. It's just great to see that. Really appreciate you coming on, man. And if you're watching this on television, you can check out the long version on YouTube, and we appreciate everybody watching.